For Assassin on Hell initially, by far the most efficient approach is to go for Chain Lightning Sentry and do arcane runs. So here's a quick take on how to build up for this. First and foremost, you need to shop some claws at Anya in Hell or Nightmare. Anything with +3 to Chain Lightning Sentry will do, really, for both hands. Ideally you would like a quick base like Blade Talons or Greater Talons for one hand at least. You're going to want to shop some random 20 attack speed gloves. In this case I have Laying of Hand because I just quickly set up this character, but you can get it any pair of 20 attack speed gloves at most vendors in the game once you're high enough level. For build I'm using a Topaz Craft for Magic Find, Elrune, Topaz, bam, 20 to 30 Magic Find, hopefully some resistance, boots. You'd ideally like a bit of faster run, but of course initially resistances is your main priority. But yes, you're going to want a Treachery, it's semi-mandatory almost. You want the quick trap-laying frames, so the attack speed helps with that. Helm, as always, 3 Topaz. Helm, if you haven't found a base farming Nightmare Cows or whatever, you can get one at a vendor. Like Hell Chassis with a portal next to her, like a PvP portal or a cow portal. For Mercenary I'm using a Vigor Rogue initially. As soon as I have a Harmony base I'm switching to a Meditation Rogue, so I get both Meditation and Vigor. And with this setup you can already do Flat Path Arcane very quickly. As I told in the other guide, you can quickly identify which one is the right path. In this one instance I can see this is stair path, that means there's another stair path across. That leaves the flat path across from the teleport path, and I can see there's already stairs here leading up to portals, which means flat path is going to be this direction. I'm going to be skipping ghouls for the most part. They simply take too much time to kill, and they don't have the rune drop bonus that ghosts have. And they are generally a pretty small density when they spawn. Quick note about skills, I'm obviously going Chain Lightning Sentry and the 4 synergies. In this case my character is only level 70, so I haven't maxed Fire Blast yet. But I still want 1 point Dragonflight for mobility to go quicker through Arcane. Especially if there's something that's blocking me like a ghoul pack I have to get past, I can skip over it with Dragonflight. As for the Shadow Tree, I just have 1 Cloak of Shadows for like a panic button when there's something extra fast chasing me, and 1 point Fade obviously. At this point I would go next game once I get to the chests. It's the most efficient approach because the 3 chests in Arcane are like the old lower Courage chests. So they can drop a lot of runes, but they are capped at a low rune instead of a Ember rune. Now as for fire traps for cows, which also is quite popular, it's nowhere near as strong as this approach initially, but once you get some plus skills it can work. Let me show you how it works at this plus skill level. You're just not going to have enough damage initially. It's going to take way too long. And if you get extra fast or Vigor Aura spawn, you're in trouble. Now, one thing, if you would like to do cows with this build, you could also invest in the Death Sentry. In this case I'm only level 70, so I can't even max it. I'm not going to bother at all. As you can see, here's the extra fastback. The Merc is dead. I'm going to be chased. It takes a long time to kill things. But if you hate running Arcane and want to go fire traps for cows, I think once you can get like a 3 traps circlet and or a 3 traps amulet, then your damage starts to be at a point where it's decent enough for hell cows. Especially if you get some upgrades like Pus Spitter for a rogue mercenary for the lower res proc, then your damage starts to become pretty good. As for a couple of very early upgrades, you would like a gold wrap obviously pretty quickly. Magic Find and the attack speed helps get your trap laying breakpoint. Another thing would be Scalders, which I would make a really high priority. Obviously it's not easy to give up the attack speed on Treachery when you're using Fate, but you can usually manage away with 20 gloves and 1 Shale Rune socketed in weapon, and maybe using gold wrap. One way to get out of Arcane really quickly early on is to go for Mind Blast. I think there's a few pieces you'd really want for this, especially if you want to run Travancore and Chaos, which I think is the ideal spots for this build. You'd really like to hit 65 cast rate. You can play with 42, but 65 is really where you want to be at as soon as possible. You need obviously some half decent resistances, lightning and fire mainly for Chaos. You'd really like a Nash staff offhand for the blink charges. You could start with the teleport charges staff that you can purchase at a Kara with a cow portal or a PvP arena in a few minutes if you have a filter. But ideally, Nash staff is what you want because of the recharge. Now to get 65 breakpoint, you might need 20 cast rate gloves. It depends a bit on your claw situation. In this case I just have a shoved 3 Mind Blast claw because I was pretty lazy. Ideally you'd want a 3 Shadow Disciplines claw at least to help boost your weapon block and fade as well. But you could get started with a 3 Mind Blast offhand. For the main hand I'm going to use a Caster Craft usually. In this case I rolled 2 Shadow Disciplines, so it's really great obviously. You might not get that lucky, but you could get started with less. Ideally though, you get a Neophyte if you can get a 3 Mind Blast base with 2 sockets or 0 sockets that gets 2 sockets from Larsak. This just gives you so much with the 30 cast rate and 2 mana per kill as well on top of the Mind Blast, and will let you hit 65 breakpoint very easily. But there's not too many bases that are capped at 2 sockets for claws. So you kind of probably need 20 cast rate gloves, either Mage Fist or Tranks, which I use in this case. You could use a Prudence chest. I think it's worth the Malrune investment just to hit the 30 cast rate, always and mana per kill. It's probably going to be difficult to get an ethereal base, but you could just as easily use a non-ethereal base. It doesn't really matter. I think it's worth the early investment just to get off the ground with Mind Blast. But if you've been lucky, you might have gotten a Viper Magi or a Spirit Shroud early, which also provides cast rate obviously. And then in the case of a Spirit Shroud you also have Canopy Frozen. Typically you would probably use a Caster Craft belt, but here I'm using a Topaz Craft for Magic Find because I already hit the breakpoint without a Caster Craft. But you could get a 20 cast rate craft belt, Caster Craft, without spending too many tier runes if you're lucky. Otherwise, cast rate rings are the obvious choice to hit the breakpoint obviously. But you also need resistances, so you're probably going to use resistance rings. I mean, Fate gives a lot of res, but since you're not using a shield, it really doesn't help you as much as you'd want. You could obviously cover a lot of res with charms if you farmed Arcane for a while. In this case I have basically no charms, almost. But cold res, it's not that important, like 30-40 cold res is decent for hell, but fire and lightning, you'd ideally want capped for chaos. You could get it by with a little less than capped, but let's say you're at like 50-60 lightning res. Once you get to Diablo you have to really kite because the beam is going to hurt very much. So ideally you cap the lightning res as well as fire res for chaos runs. In this case I have a Maras just because I was lazy to make the character, but ideally you would want a 2 or 3 Shadow Disciplines amulet, I would say, just to boost your damage. You could have some res on there if you have a rare or a craft, but most likely you're not going to have res. The helm slot, you're going to shove a 3 Shadow Disciplines helm at Hell Charcy. You can pop a cow portal or a PvP portal next to her and it'll only take a few minutes. You'd want to Larsa quest this for 2 sockets ideally. Get some Tobuses in there because you're not really going to have much of any MF outside of that slot initially. Maybe if you're lucky in Arcane you have a Geats by now, but it's going to be a struggle to even hit 100 MF on this build initially. If you have great charms and already made your FCR breakpoint, maybe you can fit a Nagelring into the setup just to boost your Magic Find a bit. But otherwise something like a Topaz crafted boots with Magic Find and Riz might be a decent choice early on. For Diablo I would definitely do the 4 Topaz chest swap just to boost the Magic Find for his drops. I think it's going to provide a lot of value over time. But as you can see, level 31 Mind Blast damage is already very good. And this is achieved with just the claws, the 3 Shadow Helm and a 2 or 3 Shadow Skills Amulet. So with this damage, a decent Mercenary. In this case I'm using 2 decent safety crafts to get his PDR so he can survive, and I'm using a Lawbringer Ethereal 2-hand sword. The damage is decent, the Decrypify helps him survive, but it also boosts your Mind Blast damage. You could just use a decent 2-hander with high damage, but if you find a base for Lawbringer it's pretty good. As for the skills, you're going to max Mind Blast obviously, and the 3 synergies: Cloak of Shadows, Shadow Warrior, Psychic Hammer. Psychic Hammer is a single target for Fizz immunes, Cloak of Shadow is utility. You'd want 1-point Dragonflight for a bit of extra mobility, because even with a Nash Staff you're gonna run out of charges sometimes. Now as for the remaining points, you could do either Fade or Weapon Block. I think the diminishing returns on Weapon Block are quite high, and since you're a ranged class, it's not that great. So I'd probably lean towards Fade, but it comes down to how many plus skills you have really, because Fade obviously also has diminishing returns pretty quickly. Like this, you can do probably 4-minute chaos or less already from the get-go, as long as you're skipping most white mobs that aren't high density. Just focus on ghosts, undeads and demons, elites. In this case I'm doing these demons here, but it's not really worth the time. It's mainly because they're in the way. But as you can see, with 5k damage they die pretty quickly anyway. Now, an early upgrade you'd really want, of course, ideally, is a pair of Shadow Killers, or at least one. It's just such a big claw for this build with a 20 cast rate and mana per kill on top of the 3 or 4 skills. The only thing is the requirements are quite high up for a hardcore, so ideally I would socket it immediately with a quest or a Elastic Malice to put a Hell Rune in there, just to bring the requirements down a bit. One early transition you could do into maps on Assassin now is Blade Sentinel, Blade Fury. It got buffed for Season 8, so it's now a really strong build, at least early on. You could build around something like an upgraded Hardcarver or a Flesh Ripper initially. Both are decent weapons, but for hardcore I'd really want a full Natalia set, ideally with a Stalker's Call for the second claw. You could use something like a Jade Talon paired with a Natalia set initially, but Stalker's Call is really the choice you'd really like. Natalia set provides all the defensive stats you need, and it gives you extra sockets, which you can fill with stuff like Topuses to help your magic find, which is going to be a bit of a struggle initially otherwise. I think there's just so much value in this set, especially for blades early on. Stalker's Call is great because it provides Deadly Strike, and it also lowers your Dragonflight cooldown a bit, and it's easy to hit the max attack speed breakpoint with when using Fade. In this case I'm using a 15 attack speed jewel in the helm, a pair of Ling of Hands and a Shale in the weapon, and that's my maximum breakpoint already. Otherwise you could use Grave Pommer's Gloves, or you could use a High Lord's. In this case I'm using Strings for PDR, which you need on hardcore for survivability, but you could also use a Gold Wrap perhaps on softcore, help you get the attack speed and some magic find. I'm using a Raven Frost obviously for Cannot Be Frozen, and in this case I'm using a Nagel Ring on the second slot to get a bit of magic find. As you can see I'm pretty low on magic find, but if I have a Geats on top I could already be at close to 150 here, which is somewhat decent for maps. For the Mercenary, I'm using an Act 2 Defiance Mercenary with the Reaper setup. You could obviously use the BO Mercenary still if you have a setup for him, but if you have a decent Reaper setup, I'd say it's worth using. The Defiance helps you makes you a bit tankier, and the Amplify proc, especially if you have a Black Hades like this with 60 attack speed, you can proc Amp very quickly. As for charms, you just use whatever you have really. You don't need Trap Skillers, but you can use Trap Skillers obviously to boost your damage slightly. Skill wise is Blade Sentinel your main skill, and the two synergies, Blade Shield and Blade Fury. 1 point Dragonflight for mobility, but in the case I'm using Stalker's Call I already have Dragonflight from that, so you don't need it. In case you're not, you would want 1 point Dragonflight. Going to max Claw and Dagger Mastery for damage obviously. 1 point Cloak of Shadows for utility when you run into dangerous packs. I accidentally put 1 point Mind Blast here. You want 1 point Shadow Warrior for tanking Fanaticism packs, etc. sometimes. Otherwise remaining points are Weapon Block and Fade. In this case I put more points into Fade for the res and PDR. But this setup can do tier 1s already very comfortably. I think your main ones are going to be Horizons, Torgen and Cistern. Horizon is obviously a really strong choice with the two kinds of ghosts in there, but Torgen is going to be the easiest map initially. Now as for the strongest budget assassin build for early maps, it's a Whirlwind, I would say. Even with the Chaos nerf, it's still very strong, especially if you stick to tier 1 maps. The nerf on Chaos is not that big of a deal for this build. I'm still using full Natalia's here, as on the Bladeson, paired with a Chaos Claw. I think it'll do just fine. In this case I still have the attack speed jewel in the helm, which you could obviously replace. I changed the gloves for Grave Palm, just because the damage to undead is better, and the deadly strike as well. For the offhand I'm using a Demon Limb for attack rating, which might be an issue depending on your charm setup. I'm still using the Act 2 Defiance Mercenary here with a Reaper setup. I'd probably want to use the BO Mercenary actually, because my damage reduction is already great in this setup, as you can see. So it's less of a deal, but obviously my defense is very poor without Defiance, so it's still useful in that department. But if you have a setup like this with high attack speed, I'd say Reapers is still very good, otherwise I would definitely go for the Act 5 Battle Orders Mercenary. Maps are still pretty much the same. The choices as with Blades, but I think Horizon is the #1 pick for this build. With the double coasts and the narrow pathways, it's just ideal for a Whirlwind Assassin. In this case you definitely want to use Grave Bomb over Laying of Hands, since Horizons doesn't really have that many demons. You could even use Cool Hide for Mana Leech if you need it. Skill wise, 1-point Dragonflight for mobility still. You want it sometimes just to move between packs or get across some obstacle. 1-point Blade Shield, max Claw and Dagger Mastery, max Fate, max Weapon Block, 1-point Shadow Warrior, 1-point Cloak of Shadows for utility and defense, max Venom, and then I opted to put the remaining points in Cobra Strike as a synergy to Venom. It's not as great as it used to be, but I think it's still the most logical choice for the remaining skill points. And you obviously have the 1-point Tiger Strike, which you need to use to buff up your splash damage initially. First choice for endgame mapping on Assassin is going to be a Trapson, no surprise. Most people are aware of how strong fire Trapsons are, especially if you stick to tier 1 and tier 2 maps, where the monsters have less life. But here's a showcase of a lightning Trapson to see how strong it is actually endgame with enough gear. Gear wise, pretty straightforward. You're going to want lightning skill damage large charms. You want +6 on each claw slot. In this case it's a test stash, which doesn't have claws for some reason, so I'm using Bardox just to simulate. But in the case of hardcore you would probably want 1 plague here, just to have the curse reduction so you're not amplified as long, and a crafted or a shopped +6 claw with facets on the other slot. Important is that one of them is a quick base like a Greater Talon. Since you're going to be running Fate, you want a 20 attack speed gloves. You could use crafted topaz gloves with 20 attack speed, or whatever rares you can find, or perhaps some slam, depends on your other slots. If you have 10 attack speed slam on your belt, you might not need 20, so you could use another pair with only 10, like Mage Fist with 10 attack speed slam, or in some other rare, like, unique, like Chance cards perhaps. Gear wise, I'm using Enigma on the chest, Griffins on the helm. Using a 4 traps amulet here for maximum damage. You could use a Maras if you need res badly. I'm using rare boots with resistances and magic find, and skill rings. Well, 1 Wraith Fruit first in this case, as I have no other source of Cannot Be Frozen. You could use Dongos as belt for a bit of extra safety on hardcore, but the 20 cast rate really helps with your Cloak of Shadows and blink animation. And obviously I'm using Infinity Merc with a standard outfit. My number 1 pick for Assassin in endgame maps is going to be Phoenix Strike. Now you can obviously play this build quite a bit earlier, even on hardcore maps. You just have to be mindful of the enemies if you're not tanky enough yet with a Storm Shield. But here's what it looks like in endgame with a full setup. For weapon, you're going to want Stalker's Call when you have high damage. You're mainly limited by the mobility you have, so you don't need the extra +2 from Bartox. You're going to want the lower Dragonflight cooldown, and ideally you'd want a 3-socket corrupted one here. You're going to want 220 or 320 gloves. I like crafts with res or magic find. In this case I have magic ones. You want a skill ring, ideally with a leech or life per kill or magic find slam. Dongos. Second ring could also be a skill ring. I think with Infinity you don't need the attack rating from a Ravenfrost, because Conviction lowers the defense of mobs, so if you're high level and you have an Infinity, I don't think it's necessary to wear a Raven. For chest I'm using Arcane's Valor here. You could also use Skulders, which I really like. If you can get a 3-socket one, you're just going to have quite a bit less life than with a Valor, which is something you might consider important. For helm you're going to use Kiras, ideally with a 3-socket slam with lightning facets, which I also have in the chest, since the main damage from Phoenix Strike is the chain lightning. Amulet, I'm using Maras here. I need the res, and I don't really need the res because I have pretty good gear. You could use a Bloodcraft with life per kill, 5-6 life per kill, +2 martial arts or assassin with other stuff, which might be the best choice. But I was a bit lazy when setting up this test character. I'm going to use a Storm Shield here. Ideally you get a 3-socket slam or a +1 2-socket slam or some other slam that's really good, like increased block perhaps. Boots, I'm using Water Walk here, faster block, bunch of stats. You could use rares or craft it with magic find and res. Depends on your setup. You could build this differently, but I built it with Fade in mind on this setup, which means you have plenty of res, so you don't really need a lot of res and gear, but it's possible to build around burst of speed, and then you would need a lot more res on your gear. But it all depends on which maps you like to run and how good your gear is. Skill wise, Phoenix Strike max obviously, 3 synergies maxed. In this case I haven't put 1 point in Dragonflight because I get 1 point from Stalker's Call, but if you're playing Bartox you would want 1 point Dragonflight. I have 1 point useful skills, 1 point Blade Shield, remaining points I put in Shadow Master here for tanking a bit. As for the playstyle, you're going to want to Dragonflight to the next pack pretty much as soon as you see a Chain Lightning proc.